Hey, this is John with FixYourDirtBike.com, and this is how to service the steering stem bearings on your 2009 through 2010 Honda CRF450r. You will need a steering stem nut adjustment wrench, a long nut and bolt bearing press, and a metal pipe that fits over the steering stem but small enough to match the diameter of the inner bearing race. The adjustment nut wrench costs around $13, and you can get your press parts and metal pipe from your local hardware store in exchange for money. Start with your bike on a stand with the front end disassembled except for the forks. Loosen and remove the steering stem nut and washer followed by the forks. Remove the steering stem adjustment nut and lower the steering stem out of the steering head. Clean all components and check for obvious damage or wear to the bearings and welds. Do not try to remove the lower bearing unless it needs to be replaced. Clean and inspect the steering head and check for damage to the races and welds. The bearings are two pieces with the outer race mounted inside the steering head. Do not remove the outer races from the steering head unless they need to be replaced. You should be able to separate the bearing from the stem with a hammer and chisel. This never works for me, so I went straight to the cutoff wheel. This is a 3-part cut because you cannot get a perpendicular angle to the bearing. Start with a parallel cut about 2 millimeters from the bridge, then make 2 cuts in a V shape between the edge of the bearing and the parallel cut. Make sure to take your time and watch your depth and you'll be fine. I got a little too deep on my angle cuts, but that buffed right out. The outer bearing races have a small lip that sticks out inside the steering head. Take a screwdriver or another long flat tool and hammer the race out of the steering head, working around the race as you go. My outer races were not cooperating, so I used a blind bearing puller to avoid damage to the steering head. If you don't have a blind bearing puller set, most chain auto parts stores have loaner tools available with a refundable deposit. Inspect the race bores and correct any damage before installing the new races. I will be installing a new all balls bearing kit. This kit includes new bearings, outer races, and seal washers. Slide the new seal washer onto the steering stem with the wide side facing away from the bridge, followed by a thick layer of grease. Place the bearing on the stem with the small side facing away from the bridge and drive the bearing home with your metal pipe and hammer over a solid surface. Place your new race in the bore with the wide side facing out. Assemble your bearing press with the bolt head on the pressing side. I like to use the top bridge as a spacer because it rests flat on the bottom of the steering head. On the bolt side, you will need to find a washer that will fit over the race but still clear the outer bore. As with most bearings, some adjustments may be needed to keep everything aligned. Press the bearing race into the bore. These bearing races are not an interference fit, so they will press in easily. If you are forcing them in, something is wrong, so check your angles and try again. Run your fingernail along the bottom side of the race to check for any gaps. My race did not press into the bore completely, but I was able to correct that with a socket and hammer. Repeat with the bottom race. Steering stem bearings require an extreme pressure grease. There's very little heat generated in the steering head, so the grease can't be too thick or it will not move around the bearings. Moly-based greases provide the best protection under extreme load, but they are also extremely thick. General purpose grease is the right consistency, but provides very little pressure protection. I find that a lithium-based EP grease provides the proper level of protection at the right consistency. Apply a thick layer of grease around each bearing and outer race. You want as much grease in those rollers as possible, so don't be stingy. Install the top seal washer with the wide side facing down. Install the adjustment nut tight to the steering head, then work the stem back and forth. This will disperse the grease and allow you to check for any rough spots. Loosen the adjustment nut to the point where the steering stem rotates freely with no play. Install the forks, but only tighten the upper pinch bolts. Install the steering stem nut and torque to 108 foot-pounds. Recheck the steering action. You should be able to rotate the stem freely with no play. Assemble your front end without the steering stabilizer and ride around for about 30 minutes. Check your steering action, adjust if needed, then install the stabilizer and number plate. You can find this step-by-step guide and much more at FixYourDirtBike.com. If you have any questions about this steering stem bearing service, please let me know in the comments or on social. Thanks for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe.